Welcome everyone to this Finance Watch dialogue. I'm Benoît Lallemand, the Secretary General of Finance Watch, and I'm delighted to be moderating this discussion around the opportunity to push for an ambitious integration of the social dimension into the taxonomy. Just yesterday, as you must have heard, the European Parliament adopted the taxonomy regulation, which is an important milestone in many ways in delivering the European Green Deal. The EU is now the first region to have a classification system for environmentally sustainable activities. There's more work to be done, so this environmentally sustainable classification system will be extended to other dimensions of the environment. And it already includes sort of minimum social standards. We'll be mentioning those, but clearly now the discussion would be about integrating in a much more ambitious way and in a broad sense the social dimension of sustainable economic activities. I think this is also topical when, as today, in fact, the European Council is discussing the EU Commission proposal for a recovery package in a post-COVID-19 context to kickstart the economy again, and where we often hear that the social dimension and the environmental dimension are opposed to each other. So people will say we need strong green strings attached to the ongoing fiscal expansion, and others will say, oh, well, that would come at a cost of jobs, so you shouldn't do it. So there's there's an important discussion to be had. Sometimes, let's face it, it's also used by, I would say, the old economy incumbents to prevent the green and digital transformation that the EU has promised. With me to discuss this are Antje Schneeweis from the Südwind Institute. She is a researcher there. Isabel Sherman, who's Confederal Secretary at the European Trade Union Confederation, ETUC. Both are members of Finance Watch. And then Elia Trippel, who's a project team leader on sustainable finance at the European Commission. The way we'll proceed is that first, Elia will remind us a bit about the European agenda on the taxonomy and where the social dimension fits. And then Antje from Südwind will present the substance of a report that Südwind published this week in German, will be published next week in English, and we'll forward it to the participants to this webinar, which addresses the social dimension of the taxonomy. And then we'll hear from Isabel from ETUC, the more trade union perspective on this social dimension. And then we'll quickly open to the audience and take your questions. We'd like this discussion to be as interactive as possible. We had about 150 registrations within just a few days, which shows quite a high interest from you. So please start putting your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom. I'll be looking at it. The other panelists will be looking at them. And I promise you we'll try to respond to as many of these questions as possible after the three interventions from our speakers. So now I'll give the floor to Elia for a short introduction to the work of the EU Commission on the taxonomy. And then we move to Antje and Isabel. Elia, the floor is yours.
So I will just spend a few minutes to quickly explain the 2018 context of the taxonomy proposal, in order to also show a bit the differences between what it is that the Commission proposed a few years ago.
Okay, Antje, I propose you go ahead, and we'll listen to Elia later on.
Okay. We are working, Südwind is working on social and development issues. So we had a look at the green taxonomy and with a social perspective. And the first thing we did is to ask what is already, which social issues are already included in the green taxonomy. And of course, these are the social minimum safeguards, that is the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. But we also found that the do no significant harm criteria of the green taxonomy also already reduce social risk, because if you reduce or regulate pesticide use, you of course have a social impact, because then the occupational health and safety issues are less, and risk for communities are also reduced. However, we found one thing a bit disturbing, and that is that the green taxonomy concentrates on the economic activity, which makes sense if you look at the ecological consequences of a company. Or actually the green taxonomy wants to redirect capital, and you don't want to redirect capital to a whole company, but to economic activities, and you want to have an impact there. We think, however, that that is problematic when it comes to social issues, and we ask ourselves how this could be done, how you can actually relate the UN guiding principles to economic activities. And I think the EU Commission already noticed the problem, because they said that they wouldn't prioritize tax evasion, consumer protection, technology transfer, and fair competition, exactly for this reason, because you can't relate it to an economic activity, but only to a whole business. But we think, as I said, that there are more problems, and there are even problems with the complete social safeguards. The next issue we have with the existing green economy taxonomy is that the issue of value chains has not been solved so far. And this is a quote from the annex, page 50, which says that must be clarified. And this is even more so when you look at the social risks in the value chains of the sectors which are included in the green taxonomy. We actually made a big effort, had a look at all sectors included in the green taxonomy, and looked for the social risk, either in the economic activity itself or in the value chain. You see an example here from our study, which is the manufacture of aluminium. There you have social risk concerning occupational health and safety, and health and safety of the surrounding communities in the upstream supply chain of bauxite mining. And similar you have when it comes to biomass, biogas, and biofuels. You have big problems in Malaysia and Indonesia with palm oil, with forced labor and child labor. You find all this in detail in the study. It's just to show an example. But we didn't only look at the social issues already included, we also made a proposal how to introduce a social dimension into a European taxonomy. And our suggestion is to have actually two taxonomies, but with very similar structures. We quite like the structures of the green taxonomy. We are a big friends. We like the taxonomy. And so we said, well, a similar thing could be done with social issues. So you could identify, or we did identify, sectors with high social risk. We identified sectors with social benefits. We looked at possible social thresholds and social do not significant harm criteria. And of course, if you have a social taxonomy, you also need ecological minimum safeguards, just as you have social minimum safeguards for the green taxonomy. That is our proposal. To go a bit more into detail, we identified 6 risk criteria. We choose that from international publications from the UN, European Commission, and so on. It's not difficult. The correlation between these studies, which sectors they identify, is very high. And of course, here are some overlappings. For example, infrastructure is a risk as well as an opportunity. So now we were thinking about the thresholds for these risk sectors. And for this, we had a look at the sector associations, the sustainable sector associations of these sectors. And we tried to find out what is missing, because what is missing would be an ambitious aim for a social taxonomy. And we found that these sector associations, the guidelines, we had a look at the guidelines, do not include living wage or living income and are quite weak on the issue of complaint mechanism. So we think companies which have a strong guidelines and actions on these issues in risk sectors should be supposed to be social, and that this is our threshold for a social company or in the risk sectors. This is especially the case with living wage and living income. If you relate that to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, you see that living wages and living income has a positive impact for 10 out of 17 SDGs. So it can make a huge difference if companies work more strongly on this issue. And the other issues which are missing is, as I said, complaint mechanism. They are very essential for a positive change. You have to make it possible for people and groups to complain and to make issues transparent for companies. If that's not done, there is also no learning possibility. The UN guidelines identify this as an instrument for learning as well, because human rights are so complex, it will not be possible to change this from one day to the next. So companies have to learn, and the complaint mechanism is a very important tool to learn how to implement human rights. A third issue, which is actually included in the guidelines of the sector associations, but we still think is very important, are trade union rights. We know that in a lot of countries, trade union rights are neglected, are violated, and they are very important for your remuneration. So there is a link to living wage, but they are also very important for occupational health and safety. And of course, they are a right in itself. So these three issues, living wage, living income, complaint mechanism, and trade unions rights, we suggest as thresholds for risk sectors. So we also try to identify sectors with social benefits. That is also not very complicated. We had to look at the social bond principles and at development banks and how they are looking at this issue, and found health, social infrastructure, education, micro and SME financing, and civil conflict transformation. The new issue here is civil conflict transformation. However, we think that especially for Europe, peace is a very important issue, and there is a study from the World Bank saying that $1 invested in civil conflict transformation saves $6. So it's a big investment opportunity, especially for the society. Maybe not for armament companies, but for society, it's a big investment, and we would like to put this forward for a social taxonomy. Of course, there are also risks in these sectors. Besides opportunities, and we suggest to deal with them like that. For a threshold, we suggest that you have to differentiate between availability of a product or a service. That means that somebody is building a hospital, and the access to this product and service, which means that everybody actually can join the service of this hospital. And we think that access to social services, access to the sectors which we have positively, which we have chosen, is an important threshold for a social taxonomy. And we think that it's not only to give a new access, but also to have a continuous access to these services and products, and especially in Europe, I think the issue is often not that much that parts of the population are excluded from healthcare, but that, or other issues like public transport, but that the continuous access is in danger because it costs a lot of money to keep up all the infrastructures, all the maintenance, and so on. So all this maintenance and maintaining the access of all whole of the population to social services would be a social investment for us. There are also, of course, do no significant harm criteria for this issue, for this sector, for all sectors, and I can show you an example for that. This is, for example, clinical trials in the pharma industry have to be conducted according to the prior informed consent criteria, and there are other things and other issues for other sectors. Here's an example for how we think about the issue of access. There is the Access to Pharma Index published by an NGO in the Netherlands, and they flesh it out what is meant by access to pharma, and that could be done for other sectors as well. So just to give you an overview, the threshold for social risk sectors would be living wage and income, complaint mechanisms, and trade union rights. The threshold for social benefits would be facilitating continued access to social services. And then there would be sector-specific, do no significant harm criteria. Yeah, a problem which obviously should be discussed is whether we need one social taxonomy, two taxonomies as we have suggested. There are problems with this because there are sectors which are quite strong, which have quite strong issues on both sides, social and ecological issues, which would be agriculture, infrastructure, and transport, for example. So it might be a bit problematic if you have two for these sectors. And of course, there is a problem of integrating ecological standards in the social side and social standards in the ecological side, as I have said. On the other hand, you could try to establish one taxonomy. Then you would choose sectors which have social and ecological risks, sectors with social and ecological opportunities, and you probably have the same ecological and social safeguards. And there are problems with this as well and drawbacks. Maybe you have too few sectors where all issues have the same importance. And you might also, as I've shown in the beginning, have a problem with methods with linking things to economic activity or companies or part of companies. And you might have a problem with the thresholds as well. As you've seen, there are not quantitative thresholds so far, which I have suggested. Still, when I think of a social taxonomy, there are certain points which I think should be included. And the first is that we have to have a link to the SDGs, of course. The second is that we have to differentiate between social risk and social opportunity. The third is that living wages, complaint mechanism, and trade union rights should be central in them, and that access to social products and services are important, and that we have to introduce civil conflict transformation. So that's it. I thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Antje, for this comprehensive presentation. There's already a few questions popping up in the Q&A. So we'll start taking them, but first I wanna hear from Elia. So Elia, sorry we lost you. So if we can go back to your what you had planned as an intro to remind us of what the Commission is doing on the taxonomy and maybe specifically on the social dimension, then we'll hear from Isabel and open the discussion. Elia.
Thank you. I'm very sorry about that. My
fine.
connection has been unstable today. But okay, let's try again. Actually, I'm quite happy that I was able to already listen to Antje's presentation now because it's extremely concrete and excuse me, very, very interesting in terms of substance already. So I won't bore everybody with the long background, and I think I will do this quickly, and then we can jump into the discussion. So what I was trying to explain earlier before I got cut off was that in 2018 we found ourselves in a slightly different context politically than where we are today. So the entire sustainable finance project and just the idea of having a taxonomy was something that needed to be still socialized also within the Commission. So we took a rather cautious approach in the action plan and in the taxonomy proposal on a number of different issues, including social, but also including the legal obligation on the disclosure, who should be captured. And the reason for that was that our main aim was to have a successful negotiation process where we could actually come out on the other side and have a product, because we did find ourselves in this very delicate balancing act where if we put too much, we might not even get the proposal through. But I think some of the issues that Antje has already pointed out, in particular with regards to social, so the fact that we have very different and much more granular do no significant harm criteria for environmental issues than we do for social. All of that were certain things that we were already aware of, but we realized that we needed to be a bit careful and try and propose something that wouldn't immediately raise a lot of red flags in terms of administrative burden. Now, we find ourselves in a very different context today. And if we'd had this webinar 4 months ago, pre-corona or pre the big economic impacts of corona, already I would have said that as part of the next strategy, social will become a much bigger point for us, because we find ourselves in a different context where sustainable finance as a whole has taken off. It's much more mainstream across the EU institutions, including the Commission. People understand the usefulness of the taxonomy, both for private investors, but also for the public sector. And it's clear that the next step is to complete the taxonomy. Starting with climate, then environment, and as soon as possible also social, which is something that is in the review clause of the taxonomy. So the review clause states that by December 2021, the Commission should put together a report that sets out the provisions that are required in order to extend the taxonomy to other sustainability objectives. Now, this is already quite strong language, and this of course came from the Parliament, and we actually appreciate it, because what it says is not that we should evaluate whether there should be a social taxonomy. What it says is that we should write a report to say this is what it could look like, which is a step further than just doing an analysis of the usefulness of it. So in order to deliver on that, we already included in the call for applications for the platform on sustainable finance, which was published yesterday, the task on developing, giving advice to the Commission on the social taxonomy, because it's something that we absolutely now need to work on. Now, I said 4 months ago, I would have already said that. I do want to emphasize that for us, the context has changed in the sense that now the social is even more important, given the repercussions that we have seen through the ongoing economic crisis. And it's not just social, it's also other elements that we have neglected previously, or at least not given enough attention to. One of them is biodiversity, because the entire theory behind the emergence of pandemics is also heavily dependent on biodiversity loss. And the social dimension is another one where we now see that we really need to do something, and we need to do something ambitious, and we can't wait for too long, because given the package that has come out at the end of last month, there are clear gaps in our toolkit in order to deliver some portions of this package, but also in order to just complete our sustainable finance agenda and allow private investors to invest into these social causes. So all of that to say is that we are definitely in a mindset at the moment where the social dimension will be one of the key aspects of the renewed sustainable finance strategy, for all the reasons that I've outlined, the latest one being COVID, but also simply the fact that it's something that we need to do. The market is already doing it. We shouldn't wait too long to do this. And I am extremely happy to have seen the level of detail that has gone into the study by Südwind. And we would really encourage you to of course apply to be a part of the platform on sustainable finance, because one of the tasks is to develop the social taxonomy. But I'm really happy also to see now the debate during the rest of this webinar, and hopefully we can also stay in touch bilaterally, because I personally wasn't expecting something that was this granular and this operational already. So thank you for that.
Thanks a lot, Elia. Also for this very sort of open explanation about why you think the Commission went gradually into more ambition and bringing the bar higher, also sort of tactically to make sure you secure gains along the way. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Would you be able to mention if there are discussions, when we talk about this political ambition and general acceptance of the taxonomy and of the role it can play, are there discussions about using the taxonomy not only for private investors and private finance in general, but to contemplate using it as a sort of compass or in a more ambitious way for public investment or public expenditures in general?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that you raised that because I think here the social dimension is also very relevant. So we actually already, as part of the investment plan that accompanied the European Green Deal, which has a funny name, European Green Deal Investment Plan. We don't like it very much because the acronym is EGDIP, so we prefer to say SAPE. There we already committed that we would explore how the taxonomy can be used by public authorities. The simple reason being that it doesn't make sense to have a different standard for the private sector and the public sector. In particular, because the types of investments that we're looking at require a lot of public-private partnerships. And in order to make these partnerships effective, including through processes like InvestEU, for instance, you need to have more or less the same understanding of what you're talking about on both sides of the equation. So we are internally now looking at different ways to use the taxonomy. We have, of course, noticed that the way in which the tool was developed was for the private sector. So we might need to make some adjustments, in particular for things like, for public support to SMEs, for instance, it might be a bit too complex. We might need a slightly lighter approach. And then, of course, there are certain types of public expenditures where maybe the activity level definition might be too granular. So there also we have to think about how we will use it. But of course, the biggest opportunity that we already started working on a while ago is InvestEU, and in particular the sustainability proofing under InvestEU, because here you can really use the do no significant harm principle that is in the taxonomy to make sure that InvestEU doesn't fund any projects that do harm to the environment and to social aspects. So now with the new package that came out in the communication, there was also mention of using the taxonomy to guide these investments. So at the moment, what we're trying to figure out is more or less the how of that, because the problem with the taxonomy is that we're still working on the criteria. Okay. The criteria are not yet finalized. The delegated acts are being developed, but we have not yet adopted them. So we need to find a smart way to bridge this gap.
Thanks a lot. That's very interesting. Let's now, before we take your questions, we've seen that there are questions coming up in the Q&A. I encourage panelists to start looking at them, so to start preparing answers. But first, we'll hear from Isabel from to hear a trade union perspective, which is obviously quite central in this debate. So Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Benoit. I think it's very much appreciated to have this session today, and thank you for inviting us indeed to discuss this very important and key domain, which is the social one. I would like also to thank Südwind for its report. I think it's going in the very right direction, and we will very much like to exchange also possibly on some of the dimensions we will see as avenues to go forward, but also some loopholes and dangers and traps we should not fall in when discussing especially the issue of the sectors. But I would like to go back to the context, and here what we see is that it's not just about sustainable finance as we have it today. It's much more than that, and I think the wake-up call came quite late, but it comes also from the angle of due diligence. and the issue of the revision of the non-financial reporting directive, which has not delivered, and especially on those dimensions which are linked to the social dimension. On the top of that, I think what is clear is that I would say, non-legally binding tools we have on board to deliver in a very limited way. And I think this is one of the acknowledgements we see nowadays, is that as long as it remains voluntary and as long as there is no external, independent and public control of what businesses are doing in terms of respecting rights, and here I would like to emphasize rights, there is no real kind of development possible towards those dimensions. And I think it is clear, and there was a real claim for the environment, and we are very happy that it has been heard by the European institutions. But clearly, the message from the outset was not to have a fragmented approach, was to have an inclusive and comprehensive approach, including social and governance dimensions. So here, to have divided the three might have been strategically, what you have pictured as a way to proceed. But what we clear is that the message is also fragmented. And what we hear is that the planet, the environment, matters much more than people. And I think this is something that nowadays, and has been exacerbated by the crisis, we can't accept anymore. We can't afford anymore. I think this is what we have to learn out of the crisis, if we would have needed such a crisis indeed, to look at those issues. And I think here, for the sake of coherence, consistency, but for the sake of the people with whom businesses is working on a daily basis and which whom should matter for investors, I would really claim for a rapid and ambitious take on and buying on the social dimension for the taxonomy. We have discussion with the European Parliament, especially on the issue of due diligence, which has gained the momentum of being a mandatory due diligence request from whole society, including business. And that was taken on board by Commissioner Renders. So here we move already ahead, a step higher and a step further, I must say, in this dimension. But we also heard from the European Parliament that the social dimension has not been really put in the focus. And I think this is, as I mentioned, a bad signal we have to restore. We have to restore the place of people in society and in the policy that have been adopted and should be adopted in the future. Second point, it is naive to think, and I think here I would really recall that we speak about rights. It's naive to think that human rights, because they are anchored in the ILO Convention, in the European Convention of Human Rights, the Treaty of the European Union, the European Charter for Fundamental Rights of the European Union, amongst others, are kind of complied with and enforced by member states and businesses. This is very naive. As long as there is not enough deterrent sanctions and there is no proper enforcement of those rights, there is means to circumvent. And if there is no call and reminder to businesses and to member states to be very on the top of those rights, there will always be people, businesses, organizations who will circumvent those rights. And I think the study of Südwind shows that. We have also a lot of evidence showing that it is not acceptable that we just look, for example, at the issue of child labor, because it's trendy and because business have to build their image on those dimensions. We speak to consumers only, but not really look into the other binding rights which are at stake. I'm happy to hear that indeed the trade unions' rights are not taken as human rights, although they are. If you look at all these instruments, human rights include trade union rights, include workers' participation. And in times of restructuring we see today, it is clearly important that any access to public money is conditioned to the respect of human rights. And the other part is that you cannot just choose and pick what you would like to respect, to comply with. I think, you know, it's misleading, and it has been the case for a range of issues like, or instrument like we've seen in terms of code of conduct, in terms of corporate social responsibility. Just pick and choose what fits you. And then on the other hand, really circumvent and violate other rights. And I think the right of minorities, for example, but we can also speak about health and safety at the workplace. It's key. So I think what we really need is that sustainability and sustainable finance is not just about the green or the social or the governance, as we clearly see currently in the documents, the regulations we see, and also in the recommendation of the expert group. It should be social and green and governance. I think this is a clear message, and we cannot dissociate all of those. The responsibility dimension of business has to be put in criteria. We understand that. In indicators, we also understand that. Those have to be clear, transparent, inclusive. And what I mentioned earlier on, it has to be possible to have a public control, a public oversight of those. They have to be comparable. And I think this is something we look into the issue of how to organize those indicators. We know that economic studies, econometric studies also look into the price of life. So what is the price tag we want to put on human rights? How important are human rights for us? And I think this is a clear message to society we have to send here. And I think it is one of the duty and obligation of the European Commission to live up to the values of the European Union, and especially when it comes to people and when it comes to fundamental rights. We can also look about the risk approach, and I think this is what Südwind has done in terms also of the sector at stake. Just to give you another information in terms of the risk related to artificial intelligence, technologies, application and tools at the workplace, the Commission has suggested to have the workplace ranked as the high risk dimension. So here we understand clearly that the workplace is specific, and here there is a kind of constellation of risks towards people. And I think this is has to be also taken on board in the dimension of the finance. The sector, I think the sector approach is interesting, but there are loopholes. And I think to identify some sector allows other not to be included or not to feel included. And I think this is a dimension we have to take on board. And I just want to take an example which also clearly see that this kind of silo approach might be counterproductive. If you look at the sector of manufacturing batteries, you know that there is a substance which is in the battery which is quite toxic. So those sectors, those industries, those companies who are manufacturing batteries have to respect health and safety standards for their workers potentially exposed to the lithium, which is the substance, one of the toxic substances of the batteries. So good, so far so good. But when it comes to recycling of those batteries, which is done by other kind of companies in other sectors, because they are not directly linked with the manufacturing of those batteries, the same health and safety standards do not apply anymore. But workers here have still to dismantle the batteries and are still exposed to these toxic substances. So I think here the sectoral approach is interesting, but it should not be the only one. And I think we should be well aware of the loopholes that it provides. And the last point, I think, which is also clearly linked to the issue of indicators, and we also understand that numbers lead the business, so to say. So you have to identify whether one violation is okay, or you need 2, 3, 4, depending on the activity, depending on the sector. And I think here this quantitative approach cannot be the only one. It cannot be the only one, and I think we need to clearly have a complementary approach, which is the qualitative approach. of the taxonomy. And I think here, the issue of how to evaluate in terms of the investment, in terms of the risk, one of the dimensions which is clearly is that the econometrics models on the basis of which such evaluations are done and estimations are done are also limited. And I think we have to be clear how those econometrics models are built, on which kind of tools we use there to be able to organize those indicators. And the last point, I recall it, I think we need public oversight. It cannot be that business are third and parties at the same time in those dimensions. And I think this is something which would reinforce the credibility, reinforce the trust that indeed at the end, the main message of sustainable finance is that people do matter as much as the planet. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Isabel, for these very clear messages. So I guess, at this stage, we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience, but what's already clear, and I think very exciting, and I guess, Elia, you'll welcome it, is that that there are stakeholders ready to engage on this debate and help to build ambitious ambition in this area in the coming weeks and months, really. So and certainly as Finance Watch with our members, Ethics, Südwind, and many others will be keen to contribute. So now I hope, panelists, you had a look at some of the questions that came up. There are some questions around, and please feel free to jump into responding to these questions. Some questions around indicators and the comparability. I think Antje and Isabel, you started to respond to some of these, including by saying, we need to look at quantitative indicators, but also maybe qualitative indicators. There are questions that come around the sort of enforcement of the thresholds and the taxonomy in general. How binding should it be? But also some attendees asking if we should actually penalize investments that are not compliant with the taxonomy. So is that a plan that the Commission has at some stage? There are questions around the link between the social dimension and the governance dimension, including around how sort of alternative business models such as cooperative models should be promoted as a way to have more engagement from employees and other stakeholders. So is that actually a governance issue that helps the social dimension? I'll pick another one and then I'll turn to my panelists for responses. A very practical one, which is that there is a French law which is quite indeed, I think, ambitious and sort of pioneer in terms of the liability of companies in France for what's happening in their value chain, including outside of France. And should that be a sort of legislative example that the Commission should look at and possibly integrate and bring it at the European level? So that's quite a few questions already. I promise you I'll be looking at other questions, but please, Elia, maybe because you spoke the longest ago, and then Antje and Isabel, if you want to contribute to these questions, and then we'll take more. Please keep your intervention as clear as possible. I see we might want to actually continue the discussion at a later stage with another session, but so now we want to take as many questions as possible. So thanks, to be concise. I
will take no more than 90 seconds, I think, to respond to the question of penalizing investments that are not taxonomy aligned. Fully understand where that sentiment is coming from, because I think we all agree that all investments should be sustainable, both environmentally and socially, which is obviously not the case at the moment. But the ambition of the project is that all investments at some point will be sustainable. Now, the problem with penalizing those that aren't in the taxonomy is that the taxonomy is still rather niche. So the taxonomy that we have at the moment is a green taxonomy, which classifies sustainable economic activities that have a substantial contribution to sustainability. Now, there are some sectors which are not covered by the taxonomy because they have a very small footprint. At least this is the case for the climate change taxonomy at the moment, and a similar approach will need to be taken with the environmental taxonomy. So in order to take an approach like what was suggested by this question, you would have to have a full taxonomy which classifies everything that is either neutral or green or sustainable and excludes anything that is not. And then you could say, okay, well, this is where the investments need to go. An alternative approach is to have a taxonomy that is green and maybe a taxonomy that is brown, to say, well, investments could go here, maybe they shouldn't go here, or, you know, we need to think about how to deal with these brown investments. Different ways of doing it, but we need to remember that the taxonomy we have at the moment has gaps. There are some light green activities, there are some neutral activities, and those are still sectors that we need to be supporting. Just because they don't provide a substantial contribution doesn't mean that they provide harm, and they might still be necessary products and services.
Thanks a lot for that clear answer. Isabel or Antje, you want to come in on one of the questions?
Yes, I would say something about the indicators. Of course, we haven't developed indicators as a green taxonomy has done it, and it was partly because we didn't just have the time. But the question, of course, occurs of whether you can have quantitative indicators for a social taxonomy. My opinion to this is that yes, some indicators can be quantitative, like for occupational health and safety, but in other areas it's dangerous. You see, when you think of the complaint mechanism, for example, it is much more important that you actually reach the most vulnerable groups with a complaint mechanism than to count who is complaining and whether you actually answer to this complaint. So there are dangers in that. I understand what Isabel is saying there. Yes, and there was a question concerning conflict transformation. This is a special social technique where there is a conflict and you try to prevent it from becoming violent. That's meant by it. Yes, so far.
Thanks a lot. Isabel, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Thank you, Benoît. Yeah, I would like to comment on the point made by one of the or many participants on the issue of the French legislation on the devoir de vigilance, which is taken up at the European level in a very kind of rapid way. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my intervention, indeed, we are speaking about mandatory due diligence obligations concerning human rights and responsible business conduct. And this including the supply chain. So here indeed, what we see in Europe is that not just France, interestingly enough, but other member states, and we have 12 member states on board, are already having something which is legally binding in terms of business obligations towards a certain dimension, most of them related to human rights, and others are in the course of thinking or preparing or tabling legal proposal in that respect. So there is a demand, there is a need on the basis of the recognitions that so far voluntary measures taken by businesses on the basis of the UN guiding principles, on the basis of other in principle authoritative documents do not work. They have their limits, they've showed the limits. And I think some of the evaluations of the implementations of these UN guiding principle by businesses in certain member states, and I can speak about Germany, for example, have ranked very badly. So we see that here a very small number of businesses do really comply. And when they comply, it could just be a line we kind of comply with without any kind of specificity and without any kind of possibility to look into how they do that. It's usually an ex post reporting exercise about last year or the year before. So it's over kind of, and there is no plan in a way that business provide in terms of what is going to be the future. How am I going to improve this dimension in the future? So being the issue of the non-financial reporting directive, which is under review and for which there is a real need to look into, being the issue of a mandatory human rights due diligence, which is on its way at the European level on the basis of good example that we can find in the member states, but that should go above what member states do propose to have these comprehensive mainstream dimensions, not looking at certain dimensions, but provided indeed what is missing. And what is missing is, first of all, to include many businesses as possible. So to have a very large scope in terms of who is involved, but also what kind of dimensions are taken on board. So not just 1 out of 8 ILO conventions looking at human rights, for example, and the one that fits best a business, but the dimension also of the involvement of stakeholders. And I think here, for example, the involvement of trade unions and workers' representatives, for which there are worldwide existing rights in terms of information consultation before any decision is taken, has to be taken on board. And if it is not respected, I don't need to have a financial sanctions. I just have to stop the decision processes of the businesses in that respect, and potentially to stop the investment if there is no respect of existing human rights. Because we all know that a fine can be paid because, you know, money is floating around and businesses to provide for such guarantees because they want just to go ahead in terms of profit and in terms of competitiveness without taking on board their obligations towards the people and towards the work. So I think here, my message is we're working on it. I think it's going in the right directions. And I think here, what is also very interesting at the European level is that we have a coordination between the different DGs, DG Justice, lead of the dossier on mandatory due diligence, but also DG FISMA, and I understand in terms of the non-financial reporting dimension, DG Trade, because it's important to have this dimension looking at trade and looking at the supply chain, and hopefully also DG Employment, looking at the working condition of workers in and outside the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Isabel. We'll slowly start wrapping up. I think it's clear from this session that there's a lot of appetite and support for an ambitious sort of work stream on this social taxonomy. There is also one of the comments that says, which relates to, in fact, financial markets already taking action when it comes to the social dimension. So someone is mentioning the example of the lack of social safeguards in slaughterhouses and how that impacted the contamination with COVID-19, and how, for example, it seems the example here is that Goldman Sachs basically wrote down some of these investments by 25%, reflecting this social risk. So that, I guess, it is a message to the Commission saying, well, yes, if financial markets are already including it, then sure, there's no reason to wait basically before going ahead, which I understand is a good point. I'm just trying to echo some of the other comments that were made, if possible. There is one, I think it may be something extremely concrete, Antje. There's a question about, and maybe there was some misunderstanding in your presentation, is there any sector where there would be no social risk? I think one of the participants seems to have understood that you mentioned.
No, I just choose the sectors with the highest social risks, especially, well, not only in the value chain, but in itself. Yeah. And well, I would say there are some social risks in most or even all sectors. Yes, of course. But of course, in mining, it's much, or apparel, it's much bigger than, say, in social care work or something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I see one or two questions that we don't have time to answer, so we'll probably do that on Twitter. So please meet us there, and we can continue the discussion. I want now to turn back to maybe Elia and Antje and possibly Isabel for a closing sort of 1 minute statement, and then I'll wrap up the discussion to respect the time frame. Elia, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be quick. Just to thank you very much for organizing this webinar. I've personally found it incredibly stimulating, intellectually stimulating, and I think for me, I have learned a lot about the different approaches that can be taken to a social taxonomy. Having previously only worked on a green taxonomy, I did always wonder how we can use the same type of system for social risks and opportunities. So I'm very, very pleased to have seen that it's possible to do that. And I think my only message would be that please do continue engaging with us also through the platform on sustainable finance. So everybody who has been part of this webinar, who clearly has some interest in this topic, do go to our website and the call for applications. We do need experts who know this area very well, because it's a specific task in the platform, and we really rely on your expertise in order to be able to push this project forward as quickly as possible. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Antje, 30 seconds.
Yes, thank you for this webinar, really for giving me the opportunity to explain my thoughts about the social taxonomy. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to continue on this.
Thanks a lot. Isabel, again, 20 seconds, or did you?
Engage with us. This is my message.
Yeah.
And one of the very important dimensions I would like to flag is that, for example, in the technical expert group on sustainable finance, there is no representative of workers at all. And I think here this is one of the missing elements of such an inclusive approach towards social taxonomy, amongst other.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I guess the message was clear that there's a willingness to be even more inclusive, I think, with the platform. Just before we want to close, and I want to thank my panelists. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. Thank the audience as well, and also remind people that there's an ongoing consultation by the Commission on the future of its sustainable finance strategy. So it's a bit broader, but it includes this issue. So I think that's a venue for everyone and really every participant here on this webinar to contribute to this public consultation, to weigh in on this specific aspect. That's very important as part of the democratic process to insist there and to increase the political importance of this issue. So please, again, respond to the consultation from the Commission. Yeah, again, thanks for everyone, panelists and participants, for this discussion. We'll be, as Finance Watch for sure, we'll keep engaging on this issue, and we will likely follow up with yeah, in one way or another to this webinar, given the success of it. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.